It was it was a paper written for an article in the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, which is the whole issue is going to be on conflict theory. And as I'm sure many of you know, the issue of conflict theory, a conflict as a theory that patients work on the basis of conflict is and that the conflict is something that has to be understood and worked out with the patient, is something that's has become less important over the years as the significance of early trauma has become more highly appreciated. So that as we've understood more and more, I mean the child people have always understood this, but as we've understood more and more about the importance of these early experiences, it's been my impression that they've taken over, in a sense, taken over our thinking about what's causative and bringing patients to our offices. So that's what this paper is about. It's about trying to figure out how conflict theory and what I call trauma theory, how they can be fit, if they can be fit together, how they can be fit together, using a couple of clinical examples. Okay. I've never seen a patient in psychoanalysis where there hasn't been some form of interference in healthy narcissistic development that has led to unconscious fantasies of causation, why this happened, and a solution, how they can make it different, resulting in intrapsychic conflict. For example, a child's egocentric view of the world leads him to experience his depressed mother's inability to nurture and mirror his healthy demands as due to his excessive needs. Thus, the ongoing trauma of a lack of mirroring leads to his needs becoming associated with unconscious fears of deadness, abandonment, and guilt. In analysis, when he begins to feel needful towards the analyst, these internal dangers pull him back to an inhibited emotional state. In short, it's not only the trauma itself that remains traumatic. Inevitably, the feelings and fantasies the trauma stimulates becomes part of a dangerous intrapsychic field. In this way, a trauma also becomes part of an intrapsychic conflict. Thus, it seems to me that analytic work has to be informed by attunement to empathic breakdowns, past and present, their effect on the patient's psychic life in and outside of the analysis, while also listening for the resultant unconscious fantasies and intrapsychic conflict. However, I still hear many analysts singularly emphasize trauma interpretations in clinical work based on interferences in development or countertransference enactments, without, at some point, working through its intrapsychic meanings. It leads to patients being helped to understand that they have split-off feelings due to current or past empathic breakdowns, without being helped to understand the intrapsychic conflicts that lead to feelings remaining unknown. The patient is told he must have felt this or that, while the reasons for his not being able to feel his feelings, especially currently, remains untouched or primarily viewed as a fear of re-traumatization. The effects of ongoing intrapsychic conflicts in keeping feelings hidden tend to be ignored. In this paper, I will present some historical reasons I think are responsible for this, its clinical implications, and two clinical examples where a trauma occurs that is countertransfer enactment, and 2 different ways it is dealt with in analysis. However, first I will briefly muse on some ways I've come to think of trauma and conflict in the clinical situation. In my work with a spectrum of patients from neurotic to moderately severe personality disorders, I have noticed, without any preconceived plan, that I tend to work first with the implications of interferences in narcissistic development. It tends to touch on the question somebody asked me earlier. That includes such things as empathizing with the feelings induced by having a self-indulgent mother or a father the child can't idealize, and the sense of danger such feelings lead to. A typical interpretation for me at this point is the following. Early in treatment, a man whose mother suffered from intermittent depressive rages described one such incident and his response of going outside to the street to wait for his father to come home. He brought a ball with him and kept trying to throw the ball higher and higher. At this time I suggested this might have been a type of smoke signal, hoping his father would get the message and hurrying home to intervene by calming his mother's anger. I have come to realize these types of interpretations generally speak to important preconscious feelings that are acceptable to most patients who don't engage in excessive splitting, as they don't arouse intense guilt. It is especially important in the beginning of treatment to help our patients understand these behaviors as adaptive strategies, as we begin the analytic process of meaning making in an atmosphere of safety. What I mean by meaning making is that with patients who come to treatment who aren't in the field, one of the important aspects, it sounds terribly simplistic, but is to help patients see that there's meaning in what it is that they're saying. We can make some meaning of it. We can understand this. It's something we shouldn't automatically assume that patients understand this or appreciate it or see that it will be helpful to them. In theoretical terms, we are speaking to what is most acceptable to the ego at this point in treatment. Such a strategy serves as an important buffer to those times when areas dominated by an unconscious sense of guilt are explored. Further, as our patients generally suffer in part from a feeling of not being heard, the analyst's capacity to hear and understand the patient's preconscious perspective is crucial as part of the curative process. This way of working is necessary, but not a sufficient step in working through developmental interferences. Thus, with the man just described, the father's seeming inability to control the mother's outburst left the patient with a sense of the father as weak, which both emboldened him and frightened him. He marched confidently through life while keeping a very low profile. In the treatment, whenever his confident or competitive side came into view, he quickly became deferential. Whatever the initial causative factors, the problem had become an internal conflict between the wish and fear to show his stuff. Empathy with the trauma, the mother's rages and feeling unprotected by the father, or the analyst's way of being, cannot resolve this internal conflict. While the analyst's kindness and tact are essential for analyzing the patient's sense of danger, behavioral methods are not enough. However, before discussing the benefits of working with both narcissistic trauma and intrapsychic conflicts, I will turn briefly to some of our historical roots for the separation. The seeds for radical discontent with the role of intrapsychic conflict lay in part within our history. Freud's move from the seduction hypothesis to the theory of unconscious fantasies based on intrapsychic conflict as causative in psychopathology sealed over the role of early object relations for some time. As Richards noted, that politics may have also played a role in the rejection of the ideas of the British object relation theorists in the United States, especially Winnicott and who's the guy who did the initial attachment? Bowlby. They might have been rejected, especially because these theories were embraced by analysts outside the American Psychoanalytic Association. However, within the United States, from Renee Spitz's work onward, studies showing the centrality of environmental circumstances on mental and physical development by mainstream analysts had little overt effect on clinical thinking. Ambivalence over Kohut's attempts to integrate intrapsychic conflicts with the traumas of childhood, followed by extreme intolerance on the part of official American psychoanalysis, seemed to be the result of this wish to again keep out parts of psychoanalysis that were associated with these early developmental interferences. The conflicts as the result of internal processes only was promulgated in awkward ways through the 1980s. As far as I can tell from the literature of the time, it was only a little known article by Sachs in 1967 that the traumatic effect of treating an external trauma as a purely intrapsychic event was highlighted. My most painful memory, analytic memory from the early 80s, occurred with a solid, taciturn woman in her 50s, Mrs. S., who came to treatment reluctantly after her daughter's analyst strongly recommended treatment for herself and because of the benefits it would bring to her daughter. The daughter had been seriously self-destructive, and the analyst felt her mother's ongoing withholding and denigrating attitude was interfering with the daughter moving forward. It didn't take long to see how barren Mrs. S.'s life was, in part because of her sadistic superego, which was also directed outward. In her controlled schizoid existence, Mrs. S. felt that she needed little, but always felt underappreciated. She found it difficult to take in what I had to offer and had little to give. Over the treatment, enough progress seemed to be made on all sides so that Mrs. S.'s daughter was able to find a profession and marry. The wedding itself was part of the healing process for mother and daughter as they slowly attempted to build a mutually satisfying relationship. I felt I was happy for both of them. The first session after the wedding, the patient came in with a piece of wedding cake. I was touched, but having been taught to not accept gifts, but analyze it, I immediately put the wedding cake under the analytic microscope for much of the week. Actually, it was more like a month. I was being kind to myself in the paper. Well, I'll make a confession. Actually, for about a month, each time the patient would come in, I'd have the wedding cake on my desk. And then I put it in a cupboard after. If Mrs. S. didn't bring it up, I would. It was only when I realized Mrs. S. was becoming increasingly blanked out that I realized this method wasn't working. Only gradually did I realize I had inflicted a mini trauma on her by ignoring the trust she felt in herself and me to give me this gift. Luckily, I consulted a colleague who helped me understand the gift as both a sign of appreciation and her newfound capacity to be able to give. It dawned on me I had enacted a childhood trauma with Mrs. S., where one of her most poignant memories was she had made breakfast as a 5-year-old for her and her 2-year-old sister so that her parents could sleep late on a Sunday. And all she heard from her mother was a bitter complaint that she had made a mess in the kitchen. While unconscious fantasies also played an important role in her gift and in my response, these could only be taken up when each of us was ready to approach them. However, what I think many of us didn't recognize at the time was how the exclusive focus on unconscious fantasies could be traumatic in itself. We talk some about trauma theory. The application of trauma theory in the clinical situation separately from conflict theory is exemplified in a paper by Lichtenberg and Kindler in 1994. Using a self-psychological perspective, the authors describe how they organize the clinical material. That is, on significant past or present life experiences, the analyst's knowledge of life experiences as organizers of fantasy and transference, and unconscious fantasy and belief as based on past and present life experiences. Thus, these authors' clinical lens is focused on past and present traumas. It would seem that in their view, as presented in this paper and other papers that Lichtenberg has written, mental forces in analysis based on spontaneously formed structures, such as compromise formations or other intrapsychic structures, don't seem to be significant causes in the things that lead patients to come to our offices. Let's see how this plays out in a clinical example from Kindler in this paper. I will say I'm obviously sympathetic to how he highlights the importance of empathic attunement, its calming effect on our patients, and the significance of understanding split-off feelings as adaptations. However, in my discussion, I will primarily focus on a problematic position this can also lead to. Further, I'm not suggesting that the difficulties I will mention with the trauma-based treatment is the wrong way to work with the case presented. After all, with any case, we are presented with small pieces of an ongoing process. Rather, I hope the listener will approach what I say as really musings on a particular approach. Jill frantically calls Kindler a few minutes before her appointment, telling him there was a power failure and no trains were running. As she's speaking to him, the power goes back on and she abruptly ends the phone call. Kindler takes a nap while waiting for Jill, who shows up halfway through the session in an agitated state. She cursed the transit system, spoke with pride about haughty behavior with a ticket collector, and eventually ran out of steam before insisting that Kindler was really angry at her. As Jill demanded that Kindler come clean about his feelings, he started to feel irritated. Musing on his nap, Kindler remembered feeling quite relaxed and alert and listening to Jill. Yet Jill was positive Kindler had hurt feelings when she abruptly stopped the phone call. She confesses it's a type of thing that would make her really angry. Kindler's response is to tell her that he was calm and fell asleep while he was waiting for her. Jill then commented more calmly now that she had noticed a change in Kindler's level of activity in the session. It isn't clear from the material how the ensuing material unfolded, but what emerged was that Jill had felt during the session that Jill had felt Kindler was energetically with her the past few days and viewed his decreased activity as a sign of his anger in response to her cutting him off on the phone. Kindler understands Jill's angry response as based, and this is the self-psychological point of view, on the loss of his calming function when he was less vigorously responsive, which often led to her perception that he was being punitive. He said, in a situation like this where the weekend loomed and the transportation system had let her down so cruelly, she was in need of a welcome that included a degree of attunement to her state of agitation to be able to maintain her sense of connection to me. In retrospect, though, Kindler wonders if by napping he was soothing himself in response to the expected onslaught that he felt would come from Jill. What's interesting is this moment seems to get lost in the entire rest of the discussion, or this thought. While I have no doubt about the veracity of Kindler's understanding of Jill's narcissistic vulnerability, we see his interpretation geared primarily to past and immediate traumas. The present trauma, Kindler interprets, is based on his affective state of calmness not matching Jill's agitated state. The past trauma, as imagined in his model scene, this is something that Lichtenberg talks about. He has these model scenes in his mind, which he described as a way the patient and analyst organize narratives, transference, and role enactments by reconstructing how things might have been. So this is the model scene that Kindler used of a distressed child, possibly after an agitating experience such as an unexpected separation, attempting to establish a lively intimacy with a disinterested or aversive, possibly depressed adult. Her efforts go unnoticed, and depletion threatens her fragile sense of self. Kindler goes on to imagine Jill becoming angry and demanding an acknowledgement of her distress, leading to a guilty or shameful response from her parents in this model scene. This doesn't convey an authentic understanding of her need for secure attachment, and Jill is left feeling like an irritable nuisance. Kindler then states, after my self-revelatory response, contact with my inner affective state, especially the image of me sleeping peacefully, whether he was or not, waiting for her, served to restore her tie to me and allowed her to return to the self-exploratory dominant mode. I can already hear John's question. While Kindler struggles with his own inner state, was he calmly waiting for Jill or withdrawing into sleep based upon the anticipated onslaught? He seems to bypass Jill's intrapsychic conflict over acknowledging her anger with him. We see indications of her conflict in Jill's insistence that it is Kindler who was angry with her. There seemed to be something in Jill that she felt thwarted in getting to the session, which made her feel angry. Recognizing this anger as her own seemed to be threatening, thus leading to the projection. Jill could then be angry with Kindler, who she felt was upset with her, not because of what was stirred up by being thwarted in getting to the session. It is clear from the transcript that Jill's thoughts about Kindler being upset occurred before the session began, when she abruptly stopped listening to him on the phone. So at least in the transcript, she was upset before actually coming in to see Kindler. So it didn't seem it was this mismatch of two affective states that was the issue. In the session, she confessed about hanging up on him abruptly. That's just the kind of thing I would get upset over if I were in your situation. Jill only calms down when Kindler asserts his calmness, possibly making it difficult for her to express further her own intrapsychic conflicts over acknowledging angry feelings. Instead, Kindler focuses on the trauma in the session and represents it as a repetition of a previous narcissistic trauma in his model scene. In one sense, Kindler and I see Jill's problems in this session similarly. How to help Jill own her split-off feelings. Kindler's answer is to take the blame for her feelings due to his lack of attunement, thus assuaging her unacceptable feelings of anger. However, this leaves Jill's difficulty with owning her angry feelings and whatever caused them essentially untouched, at least at this moment. In fact, Jill seems more ready to explore the conflict over owning her feelings than Kindler, when she acknowledges in regard to her rejection, that's just the kind of thing I would get upset over. By thinking exclusively about trauma, Kindler possibly deprives Jill from learning more about the conflict over owning her angry feelings. She is left with her unconscious fears of something bad happening if she knows that she's angry. Much of the reaction against helping patients' own feelings has, I suspect, been due to the underappreciation of the role of defenses. This leads to overzealous means by which analysts attempt to get patients to admit to feelings, often with an accusatory tone. We haven't been sensitive enough to the disorganizing effects these feelings produce. For someone like Jill, it would be important to recognize and analyze the terror of acknowledging her angry feelings and what the anger was about. The purpose is not to help patients simply recognize how angry they are. This would be based on topographic theory and the belief in aggression as a primary instinct. Rather, we hope to help patients understand what's so frightening about being angry, or why the need that led to the anger is so intolerable it can't be fully experienced. Now, a clinical example using what I call an integrated perspective. Excuse me. Thanks. I bring this example because, as with Kindler's patient, there is an external event that has a temporary traumatic effect on the patient, leading him to feel angry, which immediately leads to a conflict over his feeling. Analyzing this conflict becomes a crucial part of understanding the traumatic nature of the event. That is, while the event itself, like countertransfer enactment, would not be pleasant for any patient, and touched on narcissistic disturbances from an earlier time, we can see in this session that is the conflict over feelings that gets aroused, which makes the feelings especially traumatic. The patient is in his mid-40s, the director of a postdoctoral fellowship program in the social sciences, and it's his 4th year of analysis. Harold: I'm thinking about this great applicant for the fellowship. It's a postdoctoral fellowship he runs. I'm thinking about this great applicant for the fellowship. When she came for her interviews, I wasn't prepared for her. Her application was just one amongst many, and it was only a few minutes before I was to meet her that I realized what a great applicant she was. Then when I interviewed her, she was a perfect 10. So at the end of the interview, I told her we would really like her to come here and outline the various opportunities for her. She was pleased by the offer, but non-committal. She was also looking at Berkeley, and for personal reasons, she said she might end up there. He then continues. About a week later, I wrote her an email telling her again that we'd like her to come and that we have so much to offer. It's something I've not done before, preferring to have the program sell itself. She wrote back saying how flattered she was and how appreciative she was of the note. I was going to leave it at that, but decided, what the hell? I wrote her back and said, why don't you just come to Boston? It's great here. It was so, I would agree with him, it was so unlike my usual stance, he said, but it was fun. While he was talking, I found myself enjoying his freedom to feel playful, spontaneous, and able to enjoy the sexual undertones of the interaction without withdrawing, which was a terrible problem for him in interactions with women especially. And he was totally inhibited because he couldn't enjoy the pleasure of being attracted to an attractive woman and feeling that this was a perfect 10. So I found myself enjoying his freedom. This had been a major issue in the past. I also thought he was highlighting something I hadn't allowed myself to think about when I interviewed prospective faculty members at the university and trainees, both at the university and in analytic training. And that is the element of seduction. There's an element of seduction that goes into hiring or accepting, or if you're competing for students with other institutions, of getting them to come to your institution. Seduction in both the sexual sense, but also in the broader sense of it being, you try and tell them how great it's going to be here. So I thought he was highlighting something I hadn't allowed myself to think about so much. And then I found myself saying to him, I said, it's like a seduction. I thought I would say this in a playful manner, in the playful manner in which he was talking. However, in retrospect, what I said came out as defensively authoritative. It was as if I was showing him something new, rather than he had just helped me understand something. It was more in the tone of what I said. I didn't grasp this at the time. Even more striking is that I said anything at the time. From my usual technical stance, there was no reason to say anything, since I could see that Harold had found a newfound freedom to feel and act and observe all of this. So why say anything? There was a brief pause before Harold started talking again, and when he did, it was as if all the life had been drained out of his voice. His animated account of his interaction with the applicant was replaced by hesitation and a deadened voice. He indicated he could see what I was talking about, and talked some about it, but my comment had clearly affected him. After a while, I said to him, I'm not sure if you heard the change, but after my comment, your whole manner changed from animated and lively to hesitant and much less lively. He said, I did notice it. Now he became more animated. I was talking with Esther yesterday. Esther is one of his postdoctoral fellows who he's consistently disappointed with, as he feels he has given her many projects to do and she just barely does them. He feels Esther doesn't appreciate how much he's given her. He said, I laid out a proposal for her for the next few years, including a grant proposal that she could get an academic position. It was all there on the blackboard. All she did was complain about how much work she has to do and how she's torn between working in academia and the private sector and teaching and research. I wanted to say to her, listen, just do the work I'm paying you for. In the midst of my discussion with Esther, Sam, another postdoctoral, came in and commented on a research design I had on the board. I said to him in a not very nice way, Harold, not Sam, sorry, Sam, that's obvious. He then went on to talk about how it was another example of how he stays distant from people. He's described various ways he feels he distances himself from others and how he distances himself from me. Yet his readiness to take on blame in the face of his irritation was a familiar defense. I said, when I point out the change in your voice after my remark, your thoughts go to someone unappreciative of how much you have to offer, and how irritated you felt with someone who pointed out the obvious. While it seems possible this is how you feel about my initial comment, something seemed unsettling about these feelings, which led to your inhibiting yourself and blaming yourself for your distance, rather than blaming me. So, although this all came out in associations, in relationship to my remark, he was not making that connection that this was. So, to me, the important thing was helping him understand that he was making this connection, but for some reason there was a conflict about saying to me, boy, that pisses me off, or you really shot me down, or that sort of thing. So while I could have interpreted how he felt unappreciated and criticized by me, I would be telling him how he was feeling, rather than helping him understand how these feelings bring about a conflict over knowing about his feelings. As I've written about, this is a crucial part of a self-analytic process. So you see, I'm focusing not just on the empathic breakdown that was there, but also on the inability to fully experience some annoyance about the empathic breakdown, the conflict over experiencing the feelings. Harold. Well, what you said was fine. You were just describing what I was talking about. You said, the laugh of recognition. Maybe I just said, you said the obvious, like he had said to that, angrily to that other person. But I didn't feel it. Yet Sheila, a coworker, has a habit of summing up what I say, and I know I hate it when she does that. So I guess what you said was to the point. I realize I'm afraid that if I say something critical to you, you won't say anything again. I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but I'm worried about finding Jody, his wife, unattractive. When I saw her this morning, she looked so tired and washed out. But she really looked good once she got dressed up and put on her makeup. Did I really have to say that? You wondered? Well, I guess I did. Did you really have to say that, no, she didn't look tired, but she looked nice when she put on the makeup? It was a brief pause. I realized there's been something in the back of my mind while I was just talking. It finally came to me. I was taking this English class as an undergraduate, and we were reading one of the American classics, which he mentioned. We were supposed to write a paper on this one novel, and I went to the professor and told him about my idea. The idea had to do with a character seeing something and then never wanting to go back to the way he was. The professor's eyes lit up, like I had literally opened his eyes to something he hadn't seen before. He then, in the next class, spent the first 5 minutes about how you could never tell whom you might learn something from. You know, I wasn't really ever able to admit this at the time, but I felt disappointed that he wasn't able to say it was me. He made it seem like he saw something rather than it was me who saw something, just like I had done. I said, I wonder if you're telling us that you wish I could have acknowledged that you were seeing something very interesting in recruiting this woman, and that my comment made it seem like I was taking ownership of your observation, which I can see how that could be. While you felt disappointed and angered, you couldn't show me this side of yourself, which felt unattractive to you and might drive me away. Harold, this brief pause. You mean like I felt towards my mother, who had these frequent rages? And then he said, what do I mean like I felt towards my mother? I feel myself starting to withdraw again. I was really moved by what you said. I feel we're real partners here. Also, I started to feel some irritation with you. Then I felt, okay, enough. And that's when he started to withdraw. At this point, our time was up. In this moment, we can see Harold movingly struggle between acknowledging previously split off feelings and returning to old solutions. Harold's analytic triumph is that the struggle is now conscious. He projects his thoughts that the feelings of anger and disappointment with me echo his feelings towards his mother, and then he's able to own it. He finds himself withdrawing from owning the feeling and then pulling back from his usual schizoid-like stance, being his feeling of connection with me. However, this raises his feelings of anger toward me again, and once more he wants to withdraw. This whole sequence captures Harold's conflict over feelings brought about initially by a trauma, which led to a distance from others that brought him into treatment. The inevitable disappointments in any close relationship arouse such frightening feelings that a pleasant, removed stance was where Harold felt safest. Now, a brief discussion. My patient, like Kindler's, is dealing with angry feelings that are disturbing. I think our ways of approaching this feeling and the way I brought the examples demonstrate significant differences in how the analyst defines a therapeutic task in working through these feelings. Kindler searches for the empathic breakdown in the analytic moment and tries to imagine, via his model scenes, the historical antecedents in parental breakdowns in empathy. In short, he is searching for the cause of her anger in a particular way. However, it's been my position that to look for the cause of a feeling before exploring the patient's conflict over owning the feeling will often prove fruitless. Thus, with my patient, I focused on the press to bury feelings and the resulting deadening effect this had on him. Analysts approaching from the trauma of empathic breakdowns often talk about how deadened the patient becomes if the empathic breakdown isn't recognized. However, the same thing can be said with regard to conflicts over the awareness of feelings. I'm in full sympathy with Lichtenberg's question in his plenary to the American when he wonders about the patient's antagonism and withdrawal in the analytic situation. He says, "Are we, through perceived empathic failure, the source of the aversive response, or are we a listener sensitive to the patient's aversive stance? Many instances of antagonism and withdrawal that I had been taught to regard as resistance, I now consider a patient's trusting response to an ambience of safety." What Lichtenberg writes, so I think there's a certain truth to that. However, Lichten writes this in opposition to the concept of defense interpretation, as he understands it. He suggests that motivations become evident only when the patient can experience affects, contents, and actions. However, for the last 2 decades, defense interpretation has focused essentially on the patient's conflicts over experiencing affects, contents, and actions. With Kindler's patient, her antagonism seemed primarily based on her resistance to owning a particular feeling, that is, her anger. Analysts like Lichtenberg and Kindler have helped us understand that the patient's antagonism and withdrawal analysis can be an adaptive response to an empathic breakdown. It has been an important addition to our ways of helping patients understand their feelings. I would have no difficulty with this perspective if it didn't also include a dismissal of another important way we help patients understand feelings, the analysis of conflicts over the awareness of feelings. With the flourishing of methods to understand our patients in American psychoanalysis today, slavish devotion to any one method of understanding is to deprive our patients and us of new insights. After years of pretending all we needed to know could be obtained in the standard edition, we realize we have to keep abreast of current thinking. However, as Goldberg points out, as Arnold Goldberg, a self-psychologist, every new idea upsets the apple cart and leads to a tendency to move in 2 directions for a solution, so that people feel it is all much too diverse to encompass in a single uniformity, or it all boils down to this or that particular aspect. Further, we all have a tendency to pigeonhole someone, as I probably have done with Kindler, but mostly we are aware of when it occurs with ourselves. For example, I'm surprised by colleagues' surprise at the variety of methods I use to understand the clinical moment when I discuss clinical material. I dislike the term pluralism because in my experience those who use it justify an anything goes or we know nothing attitude when people talk about the theory of clinical experience. However, a well thought out pluralism in understanding our patients seems the only justifiable position for an analyst to take at this point. With apologies to Tom Wolfe, the analyst of today might be best known as the contemporary Freudian countertransferentially aware of self-psychological, relationally interested Kleinian-inspired ego psychologist.
It's hard to get that one out.
We can talk about it later. However, it seems to me the crucial explorations that will eventually need to take place are the differences in how we apply these methods. It's in this spirit that I've approached what I've seen as a difficulty in integrating trauma theory with conflict theory. Thank you.
Questions? Comments, please?
find time. Have you ever used it?
No.
I think I know what you mean, but we
Yeah.
haven't been discussing trauma, but major really trauma, the one that really disorganized totally the ego and produces what nowadays is called post-traumatic.
Yeah.
I think you are using it in a slightly different
Yeah,
way.
I think that's probably true. I'm thinking of it in terms of, I'm using it in this paper the way people, the self-psychological people use it as, I think what you called in the book developmental interferences. That's when there is a developmental need, an appropriate developmental need that a child has that is not met. Just talking about in the self-psychological terms, it's this appropriate time for mirroring that goes throughout childhood and life. But if there's somebody there who can't be a mirror, that's what I consider developmental interference. Kinds of, just a whole range of things that go on in early childhood, of how a parent deals with the early feeding experience, the toilet training experience. There's just a developmentally appropriate need that there's a misfit between how the parent and the child. That leads to what you call the developmental conflict. Yeah, John.
Well, I had a similar kind of question. Because there's trauma with a small t and trauma with a big T. So the kind of trauma that you're talking about is different from that of a Holocaust survivor, a plane crash survivor, or somebody who experienced a catastrophic separation, something of that sort. It seemed to me in the paper that you were trying to juxtapose conflict theory with something. I wondered if you could elaborate. Could you have used the relationship versus insight dichotomy? Is that something that you had in mind, or object relations theory? It also reminded me of Mitchell and Greenberg, or Greenberg and Mitchell's assertion that Freudian structural theory is incompatible with relational theory or with object relations theory. I think what you're trying to argue is that may not be so, but that the use of the word trauma was also confusing to me, because it sounded like you were talking about any kind of environmental effect on the child that causes distress or causes great distress. It's not the same as an environmental event that causes so much distress that the stimulus barrier is breached. Okay?
Right.
But I think what you were getting at is extremely important. How can we reconcile what we think of as modern structural theory with accumulated evidence, particularly from child analysis, let alone the study of Holocaust survivors, both of which have been going on for years and years, where obviously these environmental factors play a crucial role in conflict. How can we reconcile these two? So in that sense, I thought this was crucially important in answering Greenberg and Mitchell's assertion.
I agree with your comment that trauma theory gives the wrong impression. There's a more specific way that I could define what I'm talking about than trauma theory.
I think you explained it when you say that you were talking about developmental interference.
Yeah, yeah.
You're taking the developmental point of view,
Yeah.
and that explains it. That's
Yeah.
not necessarily traumatic, but it's an interference with development.
Yeah.
Trauma is something that overwhelms and paralyzes the ego and has enormous cost. In fact, it gets the new theories of trauma clearly demonstrate that though there are many forms of trauma, the massive trauma produces an imprint in the brain that is difficult to deal with. The other type of trauma, which is a repetitive kind of trauma, what Masukan used to call cumulative trauma. And there are studies of this. You know, there is a fellow in this country by the name of Perry, Dr. Perry, who specializes in trauma and has a web page which have several very interesting papers in trauma where they have studied people that have been traumatized in a variety of different ways, and particularly those where the trauma has repeated itself, for example, by exposure to a violent environment in the household and things of that kind. How that alters the brain structure and the brain function, and that's demonstrable. You know, it's something that we didn't know in the past. We know now, and that's why Fred is right in saying that the neurobiological aspects of many of these things have to be included into it, because otherwise you are simply not dealing with the whole problem, but with our fantasy of what the problem is. And but I thought you explained that very well, actually.
In a sense, I think the term I'm using in trauma theory is the way the self-psychologists talk about it as a trauma. The trauma in the session. The trauma was his unempathic, what he saw as his unempathic response. So it's in that context. But the paper's going to be published next month. It's too late to change it. But it would have been a useful addition. I also, it's so funny to me because people who assume if you're an ego psychologist or you're interested in the structural theory, that's how you identify yourself, that you're not interested in object relationships. And because all my training, so much of my early training in working with children was around that. I mean, that was it. I was also I was somebody who was very early taken by some of Kohut's theories and thought there was a lot to it in terms of understanding some of these early things in childhood. It was a new dimension. So it's a bit puzzling to me, and to have that view inflicted upon me. But I think it's totally integratable. It's simply a matter of our being able to hold enough models in our mind at the time of seeing a patient to be able to move back and forth, when this model is better and when this model is better. And that's the paper, the book, a series of articles that has to be written. And I think we do tend, everybody does it. The relation, we all tend to want to simplify it and say it's all this, and it makes our work much easier. It just makes it all much easier. We have a theory that says it's this, and I think the way.
Well, actually, I don't know. Analysts, what I call real analysts, which are becoming
wherever.
I've always seen this as an integrated model. You see, this idea that cognitive psychology or object relations or ego psychology, it's all nonsense. All of that is what that's what analysis was. Is what Freud used to call very early on when these things started to happen, the principles of the pars pro toto. They take a part of the theory, whether it is the cognitive aspect or the relational aspect or the ego psychology aspect, and they build it, and that's all there is. But then they are ignoring the rest of the problem. In fact, what they did is disintegrate psychoanalytic theory into bits and pieces. The reality of it is that before Freud, there was no psychotherapy, period. It didn't exist. He started the ball rolling with psychotherapy. the latest, all these new theories, cognitive therapy, behavior modification, these are all applications of psychoanalysis including the principles of pars pro toto. Now, that's not necessarily all bad. For some people, that may be ideal, you know? And when that is the case, that's what you should do. But the reality of it is that we were talking the other day here with the candidates about the integrative functions of the ego, the synthetic functions of the ego. And that's what is happening now. Again, people are integrating what once they dismantled for some reason, no reasonable reason at all. Because clearly, you have the best model where all of these things are part of human nature, are part of the human beings, and part of human relationship. Why only concentrate on this particular aspect of it's like talking of the chair and only wanting to talk about the leg, you know. What about the seat and the back and the arms and the rest of it, you know. Well, that's what people have done. That's what people have done. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean to say that sometimes looking at the leg may be the answer to the problem. Maybe the leg is broken and that's all it needs to be fixed. You don't have to be looking at the back of it. And then you do that, but you have to remain flexible and understand analysis for what it is. Unfortunately, it has been diluted beyond recognition. And when you make comments like this, say, oh, you are fossilized, you are not updated, and so on, and it's an absurdity. It was there from the very beginning, and the reason for it is that it was based on what we are going back to, and that is neurobiology. So,
Yeah, please.
That's the old maxim, fit the treatment to the patient and not the patient to the treatment.
It was fascinating to me. I've done a lot of thinking about Owen Rennick's work, and one of the things that he talks about as doing based upon his new theory about the animalist inevitable subjectivity. Some of the better things that what he suggests comes out of this is something my own analyst did, back in the first analyst did back in the early 70s. I mean, it's not an unknown technique. It's just used at particular times. So. See, in some ways, I applaud what's happening. I mean, the focus on the significance of the relationship and the countertransference. I think it's been useful, but again, it's taken as the totality rather than as part of it.
If there are no more comments, we are going to go on in.